that there is something about that one of the positives of such a repressive system is that you actually can have remarkable examples of heroism that, because such a repressive system is largely controlled by a small group of people who are exerting power over a large amount, then that means that that the extremes of both good and bad can thrive. Well, hello everybody. Good to see you all in the Craftsman's Workshop, also known as the Wood Between the Worlds, also known as a whole bunch of other things that I'm doing. What is he talking about again? Why should you even care? Why should you even be here? What is the point of all this live stream exercise? Well, I am interested in the idea of exploring what a canon of speculative fiction for our time might look like. Why? Why does he even care? For context, please go to the Wood Between Worlds Substack. You can just look for Wood Between Worlds Substack in Google. It'll take you right there. And there's a recent poster called The Sun's Reflection in Water, which is a longish post where I explore the idea of why we might want to have such a thing as an accepted canon of sci-fi, fantasy, horror, all the other mini genres that go into speculative fiction, as it is sometimes called. I kind of like the term speculative fiction. I like the idea that it's speculating on something that might be possible, might not be. But it's not a term that's in wide usage. Maybe we should change that. Anyway, in exploring this idea, I started perhaps where many of you would not have expected me to start. Probably most of you would have expected me to start with The Lord of the Rings. But that's such a behemoth, and there's so much to say about it that I'm going to approach that one slowly. Obviously, Lord of the Rings is in the canon. It's in all canons, including probably the canon of Western literature. There are barbarian noises happening outside. If you can hear it, tell me in the comments, and then I will go and take care of the barbarians with love and gentleness, of course, as the Russians do it. Love and gentleness. Anyway, no, I started with exploring grimdark as a genre. Does grimdark even deserve to belong in the canon of speculative fiction? And if you guys watched my last live stream, you might have been surprised by some of the things that I said. I was certainly surprised by some of the things that came out of that, definitely. And it's nice to see that post is on Substack right now as part of the Substack as part of the Wood Between Worlds podcast, which is slowly unrolling and is going to replace what used to be called the Fantasy for Our Time podcast. By the way, some people have been positively influenced by that post and there's been some nice conversations that I've been having off screen, off stage with some people. So hopefully that'll continue with this one. I am moving from fantasy to sci-fi for this particular episode of this podcast to talk about the Vorkosigan, I suppose is how you pronounce it, Vorkosigan Saga, a series of science fiction books by the American writer Lois McMaster Bujold. Now, I've had this series on my radar for a very long time. I read one of the Miles Vorkosigan novellas as part of a novella class I was taking probably 4 or 5 years ago now. And I loved her style. And I love the character of Miles. Miles is one of the most popular characters in modern science fiction, bar none. He's kind of like a space version of Tyrion Lannister, but not as jaded, not as messed up. He's a lot of fun. At least in that short story, he was. In that short story, it was kind of a cool setup. He went undercover onto a prison planet to try to get some people out, and he had to enter into the prison society. This was like prison in space, kind of. Which is an interesting subgenre, by the way. And those of you who like that sort of thing, The Dregs of Empire by Christopher Rocchio, excellent entry into that particular subgenre. Very good book, highly recommended. Anyway, he goes into this prison planet where everybody is under a dome, a clear dome that doesn't give them access to the atmosphere. So it's like a literal prison, but a clear one on a planet surface. And it's a prison colony, it's a labor camp. Those of you who know something about the Vorkosigan saga will know that the Vorkosigans are part of an empire that is vaguely reminiscent of the Soviet Union, which is not surprising given the time period when the books were written. Uh, the Shards of Honor, which I'm talking about today, was written in 1986. So at the tail end of what is now remembered as the Soviet Union, the Soviet Empire, such as it is. It's a great story about how he manages to get himself into a prison society, not get killed in the process, and then spring an escape in a very unexpected way. It's a very cool story. But all the Miles stories are all about like daring exercises and daring escapes, and he's a very intelligent and very smart character. So to try to figure out how he's going to get himself out of scrapes is part of the fun. Now, I kind of wanted to go straight to the first Miles novel, which I think is Brothers in Arms. I'm not sure about that. Don't quote me on it. But I decided when I saw that there was a sale on Chirp audiobooks. Chirp, by the way, is a fantastic audiobook service that has its own app for your phone, and it sells discount audiobooks only. I mean, you can buy if you want. You can buy them full price, but its specialty is doing these deals for audiobooks that can be as cheap as 99 cents sometimes. Really, really cool service. I get much of my audiobook reading from that service, especially since I know that at some point or other, most of the books that I haven't read yet and I want to, but that I know that maybe perhaps I don't have time to, I wait for them to appear as discounted books on Chirp. The ice cream truck is passing by, and I'm expecting to hear an explosion from the barbarians next door, even though they are not allowed to have ice cream at this moment, but we shall see. Yes, I'm already hearing my dear wife remonstrating with my kitties. Anyway, so I decided I would start with Shards of Honor, which is the first book in the entire Vorkosigan Saga. It doesn't have Miles in it, which is kind of disappointing, but still, it ended up being a surprisingly good book, and I really enjoyed it. But maybe even more than for the plot itself, the plot was okay. Um, kind of formulaic. The romance was nothing to write home about. It's largely a romance novel in some sense, not in the kind of technical sense. It's not really a romance novel the way that romance novel readers expect, but it has a romance at its center. It's a sci-fi romance. But really, the thing that really intrigued me was the political setup and how reminiscent it was, not so much of 1986, but of 2024. And of course, Lois McMaster Bujold had no idea that she was going to do this. And I'm not even sure how closely she wanted her respective far future versions of the spacefaring humanity to look like the political situation that she was in the mid 1960s, mid 1980s. But nevertheless, whether the author wants it or not, the reader is still free to read in to the existing work whatever applicability seems to come out of it, especially if there's a strong resonance created in that shared space between reader and author, something that I've been thinking about a lot, about this sort of shared space where the author abandons some of his or her power and the reader takes some agency on his or her own self to be able to create something new in the middle. An act of humility for both, I think. Anyway, the setup is fairly simple. There is a group of scientists on an uncharted planet, alien planet, who are a survey, geological and other sciences, biology, etc. survey team that is technically connected to the military of a colony known as Beta 2. Now, Beta 2, in some reviews that I've read, is compared to something like Scandinavia in space. It's a very liberal, democratic kind of, very tolerant society. And perhaps in 1986 that would be the case, but it smells and tastes very much like 2024 America, much more than the liberal democracies in Europe right now, at least to me. I don't know again what her intention was, but it feels very much like America of right now, and that probably wouldn't. I probably wouldn't feel that way 6 years ago, and I might not feel the same way in 10 years from now if I reread it. But this is the moment that I'm reading it in, and this is what stuck out to me. They are then attacked. This survey team is attacked by a military contingent from the planet of Barrayar, which is uh, effectively a military dictatorship with a social structure that is very, very reminiscent of Soviet Russia. There are things like, well, first off, the fact that everything is so military first in the society, that it is an autocracy, that uh, there's a very strong oligarchy slash aristocracy that runs things in a lot of ways and butts heads with the centralized power of the emperor, and also that there is a prevailing influence of something called the political office of government, which is a kind of secret police, a kind of 1984 style right think enforcer that is present at every single military or civilian uh, mission. And at some points in the story, later on in the story, we see both civilians and military people being tailed by agents of the political office in ways that people would have been tailed by the KGB had they visited Russia in the 1970s or the 1980s. So in that sense, it is quite reminiscent of kind of late stage uh, Soviet Russia versus a very tolerant kind of take America in the 1980s and bring it towards the ideal of European democracies and put it out into the future with maximum tolerance, with maximum democracy, with maximum um, lack of centralized power. In both cases, you get a kind of situation where the two poles are slightly extreme. The Soviet style pole is extreme in the direction of autocratic control and right think, and the other extreme, the Baden extreme, is one in which tolerance is so extreme that uh, that superior officers cannot ever be sure that their orders are fully followed because the democratic ethic is so strongly embedded in the people that they will simply not follow a direct order if they think it's something they don't want to do, which you can see how both sides inside a novelistic universe, how this can be an interesting setup and a very big problem. um, there within that setting, it's very interesting to see a kind of traditional love story happening between people from the two different sides, from two extreme sides, and how they're able to come together, and how despite all odds, they end up falling in love and eventually getting married, and assuming a position of political importance that is unlikely in any real life scenario. And it's one of the pleasant things about this kind of fiction, where you take political realities that are vaguely reminiscent of real political realities in our own time, and you give them the kind of glorious, consoling resolution that you probably will never see in your own life in the politics of our time. So in this sense, it's almost Tolkienian in its resolution of the dramatic problems that the main characters face by allowing a kind of almost ridiculously unlikely situation to unfold, where the truly honorable, the truly good, the truly decent people end up actually winning in the end. I mean, this is really what we want from escapist fiction, and this is sort of the point that Tolkien makes in his wonderful essay on fairy stories, as I've talked about plenty of times. But I really wanted to focus in on two scenes. They are both scenes of intense and very disturbing violence, in spite of the fact that this story is actually quite light on kind of objectionable material, except for these two scenes. The first scene is a scene of impending rape, actual rape. And so, if those of you, by the way, who are listening to this in a place where there are children, you may want to either put your headphones on right now or listen to this at another time. Um, I'm not trying to make anybody uncomfortable, but I do want to make a very interesting point. So the main character, Cordelia Naismith, the love interest, who is Baton, and is a law-abiding and God-loving, in a very vague and kind of non-dogmatic way, a kind of super Unitarian, in a kind of super Unitarian way, uh, takes a risk politically to help a an ally in a war that was unjustly started by the Soviet analog, the Empire of Barrayar. And in this way, this whole scenario is extremely and uncomfortably reminiscent of what's going on in Ukraine, where the Russia analog attacks a peaceful country. The only difference being that there is no cultural connection between the country that they attack and Barrayar itself, which is the major difference between what's going on right now in Ukraine and what goes on the novel. But the respective responses of both sides, especially the response of the vaguely democratic American, the Badens, is very similar to what's going on right now. They're helping those who are being antagonized by sending them weapons. And she does this by doing Cordelia does this by heading a very daring foray into enemy territory, into the war zone, as in order to distract attention from a freighter, a supply freighter that is on its way to send those weapons to the aggrieved country. So she puts herself in harm's way, partially because she has had experience of the Barrayarans, and the experience has not lived up to the propaganda that everybody puts out about Barrayar, that they are brutal, violent people that never brutalize their enemies and that routinely torture and take advantage of their war prisoners. That's the propaganda. And in her experience, she actually falls in love with her captor, who's a Barrayaran and is a fantastically decent one, a guy named Errol Vorkosigan. And she falls into the mistaken supposition that all the Barrayarans are honorable. Unfortunately, she falls into the clutches of someone who is the opposite of that. And here we have a situation where the real evils of a political system like the one on Barrayar, like the one in late stage Soviet Russia, like any communist or fascist autocracy, where the system is not strong enough to be able to prevent individuals taking advantage of the system in a way to exert their power over others in ways that are abhorrent, brutalizing, and frankly, just disgusting. Luckily, there is no rape scene, but it gets very, very close. She falls into the clutches of someone who wants to watch as she's being raped. And I'm sorry, this is very unpleasant. But it's a really interesting scene in the sense that she is rescued partially by her own agency. She does something that's remarkable. I won't say what she does, but it's a very, very interesting and very effective scene. Quite catastrophic in some ways. But then she also happens to be rescued by her lover, her former captor, who is able, because of the same limitations of the system that allow for the monster who tried to have her raped to exist, is able to exert the kind of control and the kind of personal heroism over an unjust system that is actually discouraged and impossible in the more democratic one. So this is something that anybody who has studied Russian history has come across. Russian history is a long, drawn-out history of autocracy with its attendant pluses and its attendant minuses. The minuses are that in an autocratic system, there is very little protection for the common man, for the simple man, for those who are low on the totem pole, from people who want to exert their power over those. There's very little internal way of controlling that other than societal strictures. And those don't mean anything to people who want to murder, rape, and pillage. However, the same system also produces the kind of cultural expectation that allows for a real kind of aristocratic and chivalric ideal to exist, and not only to exist, but also to allow for people who are strong in character to be able to assert themselves over the system in ways that other systems would simply not allow to happen because of either bureaucratic snafus or because as we'll talk about in another scene, or just because that kind of heroism isn't something that is built or cultivated in a more democratic system. Now, I'm not making a value judgment on the two kinds of political extremes that are expressed, that are shown in the story, and that we encounter every day and have encountered at least throughout modern history. ever since the establishment of the United States as an important world power. But I am saying that the book is suggesting this, either explicitly or implicitly. You can decide for yourself that there is something about that one of the positives of such a repressive system is that you actually can have remarkable examples of heroism that, because such a repressive system is largely controlled by a small group of people who are exerting power over a large amount, then that means that that the extremes of both good and bad can thrive. And so then what happens is you are largely at the mercy of who you happen to be in contact with the most. If you're someone who is in contact with the strong, virtuous, aristocratic scions of autocracy, then you're probably going to be okay, which is something you see very often in when you're reading about the history of Russia in the 19th century. You see figures like Dostoevsky and figures like Tolstoy who had real, lasting impact on common people by the force of their writing, and also shows how certain ministers in government and even the czar himself would have abilities to perform immensely uh, just like immense acts of mercy that would not be possible for someone like, say, a president of a democracy to do, because a president is necessarily bounded not just by the strictures of a given society, but by the rules of a checks and balance democratic system. Okay, that's the first scene. She escapes a terrible violation. And in that scene, we explore both the extremes of the bad that are possible in an autocratic, aristocratic, oligarchic system, but also the extremes of virtue and heroism that are possible in it. What's really interesting is that rather than suggest that the opposite political system, the Baden super tolerant democracy, is somehow intrinsically better than the repressive Barrayaran system, Bujold seems to allow for the possibility that both are equally human. And so you have to consider that most readers who are going to come from a Baton-like atmosphere, you have to consider what are some of the limitations and indeed the dangers of such a system. The danger happens in a remarkable series of events where Cordelia, after coming back from a prisoner of war camp, where she was treated extremely well, because it was under the control of her future husband, which is, anyway, we're not going to talk about Stockholm syndrome. It's it's fine. Believe me, in terms of the story, it's fine. If you think about it too much, it can actually ruin your enjoyment of the story. Don't think about it too much. Anyway, so when she comes back, because she is so normal and so calm, although she does exhibit um, certain signs of mental strain when she comes back, but those are just as much precipitated by a rather comical and kind of hilarious and awkward series of events that were entirely the fault of the Badens, and not the fault of her captors on the Barrayaran side. But anyway, the psychiatrist assigned to her case begins to develop a mania, a kind of extremely bizarre obsession with the fact that she is a sleeper agent of the Baryarans who doesn't realize it, that she's been actually reconditioned during her captivity. And she gets the government to give her the kind of power that you have in repressive autocratic states. There's even a point at which she's talking to Cordelia and explains to her that she can use coercive psychological manipulation methods on Cordelia, as even if she doesn't want that to happen, even if she doesn't give her consent, because she will be able to give her consent post factum, and that is considered to be legal. Consent post factum is considered to be legal, which is a distressing idea in and of itself. But once you see it unfurling, where the might of the military and the political apparatus of this tolerant state begins to turn its entire focus on Cordelia's apparent mental uh, instability and her hiding the the scars of conditioning, she falls into a situation where she is very nearly mentally raped by her psychologist, who now has the backing of the military to use all kinds of insane methods to try to get her to uncover repressed memories of a conditioning that had never happened. And at this point, as I'm reading, I can't decide which of the two scenes of violence is worse. Because obviously the the scene of almost physical rape was absolutely horrific. But the scene of almost mental rape, although on the surface it might seem to be less horrifying, I will challenge that assumption with a reference to another book that I read recently, Exogenesis by Petzo Goskovsky, which I have gone on record as saying is probably the best dystopian novel I've ever read. There's a scene in there, without giving too many spoilers, that one of the characters is shown a scene from a prison cell of an adjoining room where the girl he's in love with is subjected to a series of rapes from military men that he has the power to stop if he confesses and gives up information about, it doesn't matter what. That turns out to be a lie. It turns out to be a virtual simulation. However, his going through that process of seeing her being violated by a series of soldiers leads to his death. Uh, in a way, it's not quite suicide, but he puts himself into a situation where it's very likely that he will be killed, and he does get killed. So I don't know which one's worse, and perhaps they're equally terrible. Both cases of this kind of violation, both either physical or mental slash emotional slash spiritual. Why am I talking about this? The question here is that really affected me is that this entire book is on some level addressing the theme of who is good, who is honorable in a time of war, and who has the right to determine who is good and who is honorable and who is not. And does that determination come from the structures of a political society, political governmental system, and a social structure, or does it come from the choices that an individual makes? This is why the novel is called Shards of Honor, because the honor keeps getting shattered. Errol is someone who is a character who builds his entire existence on the idea of being honorable in an autocratic and unjust state, and he is forced to come up against the absolutely everyday realpolitik reality of geopolitical compromises, and he has to do something that sacrifices the lives of thousands of people, thereby, in a strange and kind of ironic way, deserving a title that he has received from propaganda on the Baden side of being the butcher of some battle or other, where in actual fact, he did not butcher anyone in that battle. He was the one who actually limited the butchery by saving many people from the actual butchers. This is a great ironic scene when the truth about him comes out, and it shows him as a fundamentally broken person on the inside who needs the healing power of the love of somebody from the other side to be able to then become an integrated whole. She also is broken in a lot of ways. She also needs integration. So the two of them come together in a really beautiful way. And then after they do that, the kind of romance between them becomes an image or a symbol of the kind of possibility for social and political unity that is then offered to him at the end of the story. And that's a beautiful eucatastrophic moment, eucatastrophic moment. I'm not going to tell you what happens. Read the book. It's really good. I really enjoyed it. But the most beautiful part of all this was actually a short story that's appended as an afterword to the main novel. It's called Aftermaths. Now, this story is one of the greatest short stories I've ever read. I'm not going to tell you what happens. I want you to go read it. But it shows in absolutely stark reality how you cannot trust the evidence of your eyes in a time of war. That's the theme. But it does it in heartbreaking, beautiful clarity, where you are forced to come away from the experience of seeing this story. You're forced to come away with the thought, I should never, ever believe what I am told about what's happening in a time of war. that's the thought I want to leave with all of you, because as things get really complicated and dangerous over in both the European and the Middle Eastern theaters of war, I hope that all of you, instead of spending your time reading the New York Times or other, frankly, partisan and not impartial, I'm sorry, I can no longer say that these outlets of media are impartial or that they're interested in ultimately uncovering the truth. That is no longer the case. We're back to the days of yellow journalism. Stop reading that stuff, people. Especially, we're about to come up against one of the most dangerous and divisive elections of our time. Read novels instead, read literature instead, because it informs and illumines the experience of what it means to be human on every possible side of ideological, spiritual, political, and social divides. And it's these kinds of reading experiences, the kinds of things that heal you first and foremost on the inside. And a healed and integrated you can then go out and have integrated and healed conversations with other people who need the same thing and who want the same thing from you, who do not want to be who don't want to be told how they're wrong and how they should think and how they don't think, but who simply want to have an experience of wholeness and integration with another human being in a time that is about as fractured as it has been during my life. That's for darn sure. So that's my take from the Shards of Honor, book one in the Vorkosigan Saga by Lois McMaster Bujold. I am going to keep reading the series with great pleasure, and if a theme emerges from the rest of the stories, I might do another Vorkosigan Saga video. But for the meantime, that's all I have to say about that.